As Russ said, my name is Vicki McBride, and as a Future Church board member, I am delighted to introduce Barbara Ann Kozee, this year's recipient of the Sister Christine Schenk Award for Young Catholic Leaders. Named in honor of Future Church's founding executive director, this award is given to a young Catholic whose research, writing, advocacy, or ministry exhibits outstanding leadership in promoting justice in the church, and whose efforts will inspire and foster a new generation of reformers and activists. Tonight, we are honored to present our 2025 Christine Schenk Award to Barbara Ann Kozee. Barbara Ann is a doctoral candidate in theological ethics at Boston College. As a scholar, Barbara is interested in the intersection between theology and the social sciences, and she works primarily in the fields of gender and sexuality, as well as peace building. Her dissertation focuses on how building just forms of social trust may contribute solutions to the current political and religious polarization we are experiencing. Prior to starting at BC, Barb received her Master of Divinity and Certificate in Women's Studies in Religion from the Jesuit School of Theology, where she founded and served as editor of New Horizons, the peer-reviewed graduate journal of the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University. She received her undergraduate degree in International Political Economy from Georgetown University. As a queer and feminist Catholic, Barb is also actively involved in the work for church reform and renewal. She is a regular contributor to the New Ways Ministry blog on LGBTQ issues. She has presented for Future Church and previously served as both a board member and vice president for the Women's Ordination Conference. She continues to stay connected to WAC's development of feminist theology and advocacy for human rights at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. Barb is widely respected and seen as a leader among her peers. We at Future Church recognize the demands of a doctoral program. Moreover, we are aware that there is a lot of pressure placed on young and promising Catholic theologians to distance themselves from organizations like ours, New Ways Ministry, and Women's Ordination Conference for the sake of their careers. And we are impressed and inspired by the courage and authenticity it takes to remain connected to and engaged with this work. And so, Barbara, we are honored to present you with our 2025 Sister Christine Schenk Award in celebration and recognition of your courageous work as a scholar activist, working for justice for women and the LGBTQ+ community in church and society. Congratulations, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Vicki. That was such a kind introduction, and I'm just very touched to hear that. I also want to begin by congratulating Future Church on its 35 years of advocating for reform and renewal within the Catholic Church. And especially when I look at past winners of the Christine Schenk Award and consider Sister Christine Schenk herself, I am truly very honored to be included amongst these theologians and advocates whom I call friends, allies, and mentors in this work. So thank you. When I think of our theme, The Spirit Still Speaks, I am reminded of the following passage from 1 Kings. As Elijah is out in the wilderness, he is told, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. for the Lord is about to pass by. Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. In this passage, the Spirit speaks to Elijah from the most unlikely of places. As Heidi mentioned on Tuesday, the Spirit is often represented biblically as the wind or the fire, so Elijah's attention there is reasonable. But ultimately, the Spirit is not in the sensational events of the earthquakes and the fires, but rather is present as a still small voice, which in some cases is translated as a sheer silence, something even more difficult to detect as a spiritual presence. If Elijah had not been attentive, patient, and open to discovering the Spirit where he did not expect, he may have missed the Spirit's speaking. Around sex and gender issues in the church, I sometimes feel this simultaneous paradox that there have been so many historic developments and also so few concrete changes. Pope Francis welcomed local trans women at his general audiences and shared meals with them. Yet his celebrated pastoral encyclical writings on the love of the family and on human dignity explicitly define and condemn the anti-trans and anti-queer rhetoric of gender ideology. The DDF's document on same-sex union blessings got the attention of even non-Catholic and LGBTQ news outlets as historic, and yet there were, in some sense, no real changes to the Catholic theology of marriage. The Synod was a groundbreaking historic moment where Catholic lay people and women voted on magisterial documents for the first time. And yet there is no mention of LGBTQ issues in the final document, and issues related to women's ordination are relegated to the famous paragraph 60. Pope Leo certainly feels like a hopeful sign of continuity with Francis's papacy and attention to the poor and marginalized. And yet he has made it clear that sacramental doctrine on sex and gender is unlikely to change in the near future. Here, I want to suggest that paying attention to the development or lack thereof of doctrine can sometimes be like the wind and the earthquake and the fire. Especially for queer and trans people and women called to the priesthood and diaconate, it can be tempting to look for the Spirit speaking in these very visible and sensational events and to want doctrinal change now. However, in my work at the grassroots level and in my research on social trust, these lead me to want to search with Elijah for the still small voice, where the Spirit speaks with hope, agency, and imagination for queer and feminist Catholics in the here and now. When we turn to the cultural expressions of Catholic identity at an LGBTQ affirming parish, in classes on queer theology at Jesuit universities, in the weekly preaching by women at Catholic Women Preach, and the fact that women completing their MDivs or PhDs in theology are no longer the only woman in the room, it is obvious that the church has in fact changed drastically over the past 35 years, and that we are making and will continue to make progress. The early years of the civil rights and feminist activist movements of the 1960s and the recent concern with declines in social trust stress a similar lesson, which is that structural and institutional change begins with cultural change. In activist movements, consciousness-raising groups were a tool to help people of color and women identify the political roots of their personal experiences, to recognize common struggles, and to subsequently take collective action. Shifting cultural values and norms allowed for the struggle for legal and policy changes. My dissertation research topic of social trust is defined as positive mutual regard for those around us and the idea that our institutions generally work for us. Social trust is thought to be the foundation for modern society, especially in a world of globalization and pluralism. As we encounter difference, social trust represents our common bonds that stress universal humanity and dignity, and is what allows us to be able to engage in conflict without experiencing polarization or a feeling of irreconcilable otherness. While elements of the synodal process may feel slow and to a degree painful for sexual and gender minorities, from a social trust perspective, this type of dialogical engagement, from the regional listening sessions to the synod itself, represents a type of institutional restructuring that ideally allows difference and conflict to emerge in a context where trust in common bonds is stressed and reinforced. And this type of hard work is where sustained and lasting doctrinal change comes from. Indeed, it is easy to pay attention to the wind and the fire and the earthquakes, but it is harder to find the still small voice. And yet, doing the work to cultivate this type of attentiveness to queer, affirming, and feminist approaches to Catholic identity in our local contexts is what will allow the Spirit's voice not only to speak, but also to carry, take hold, and plant roots. Research on social trust reveals an uncomfortable reality, which is that homogenous communities and stability seem to be correlated with higher degrees of trust, and introductions of multiculturalism, oppression and inequality, or diverging perspectives will decrease trust. Therefore, any political or religious community that would value diversity and globalization as a norm also must work intentionally against the potentially devastating effects of erosions of trust and perceived difference, all while attending to the fact that malformed expressions of social trust can come at the expense of those oppressed or excluded from the structures of the institution. Once again, this is why building trust that attends to justice is almost impossibly hard work. Living into our identity as a global church in a real and authentic way is perhaps one of the greatest gifts of the recent synod. Conflicting perspectives on sex and gender have been raised to the surface for discussion and encounter, and in ways never before seen in the church. But importantly, we must find ways to foster and maintain trust in common Catholic identity and belonging as we have these conversations, and not to accept a cheap trust that would ask marginalized members of our church to assimilate to harmful structures. And I believe we do this with attention to the still small voice, to ways that we affirm common bonds, raise consciousness, speak out for truth and justice in our communities, and form ourselves to engage productively with harm and conflict. Doctrinal change comes from our willingness to listen to the Spirit in our everyday lives and in others, and to affect cultural change on a global scale. A favorite image of mine comes from Stephanie Kuntz's book on a history of marriage, in which she says that a more love-centered and romantic emphasis within marriage that has emerged in the contemporary period simply is not going away. To attempt to change this would be like locking the barn door when the horses are already out frolicking. In a similar manner, while the church may continue to try to lock the door on sex and gender issues, the truth is that the Holy Spirit is already out frolicking. And while we wait for the institution to catch up, there is plenty of living into our spirit-filled imagination of church that we can attempt and are attempting now. Thank you again so much for having me, and I'm very thankful to be a collaborator in this work with you all.